Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 3 of Finlandia University's Philosophy 212 Ethics course. As you know, we are moving on to a new unit this week. What is Ethics 2? Major Ethical Theories. In the next 2 weeks, you'll be reading primary philosophical texts from the history of ethics. Before we move on to our discussion about week 3, however, I want to discuss with you the new layout of the Canvas page. I'd like to know what you think. Is it easier or more difficult? Does it matter to you at all? So let's look at it. So the previous unit, I had both week 1 and week 2 here. Unfortunately, Canvas doesn't give me the ability to bold. Like this would be a lot easier to see if these were bold, So in my eyes, it's kind of, cluttered, except, when you think about it, there's not that much in week 1 and week 2, et cetera, et cetera. So what I did, unfortunately, it still looks kind of clunky because the Unit 2 is its own thing. So I made the Unit 2 its own little barrier, right? And I've put the slides for Unit 2 right there. And then week 3 and week 4, which are currently invisible to you, but they'll be visible as soon as I throw up these lectures. Weeks 3 and weeks 4 are now separate, right? So you have Unit 2, weeks 3, week 4, paper 1, and then it's going to go into Unit 3 later, but that's going to be invisible to you as well. So I'm really curious as to what you think. Ooh. Okay. I changed. Oh, yeah. Sorry. I'm recording things as I'm doing things. So if we want to look at the student view, sorry about that. This is just riveting media, I know. But this is what it should look like to you right now. And there's some stuff that you'll need to do, like you have to read slides. So that was Unit 1, right? And this is what Unit 2 is going to look like. You'll notice it's also going to say things like complete all items. So you'll have to complete each item on the list in order to move on to week 4. That I'm not going to change because I actually like you having to do things in order it ensures to me that you're doing it. Same goes through paper 1 prompt and paper 1. We're going to talk about papers very soon. So that was a lot of muttering. Let's move on to the actual philosophy stuff again. It just looks a little different, but I'm hoping that it's just going to make it a little bit more simple for you to complete your work, Not that you haven't been completing your work, but you know what I mean. So, week 3 assignments. As you know, the assignments are broken up into Monday, Tuesday, and, that's wrong, Thursday, Friday assignments. Oopsies. As usual, I'm going to go through this video in order. So here are your Monday and Tuesday assignments. You're reading Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. You're watching a video called Aristotle and Virtue Theory, Crash Course Philosophy 38, and you're completing the discussion boards assignments we'll talk about soon. So last week we discussed Plato's Euthyphro, in which Socrates and his friend Euthyphro have a conversation about the nature of piety. If only we knew what it was, what piety was, we would always know right from wrong. We are now moving a few decades forward into time to discuss Aristotle, who is the student of Plato. He founded what is known as the Peripatetic school in Athens. That peripatetic is referring to walking, so they would walk around and stuff while talking about philosophy. When reading Aristotle, keep in mind that a lot of what he is doing is outlining and critiquing what people have said before him. There's a little bit less of it in the text you're reading, but that's just general understanding of what's going on in Aristotle. And he is immensely influential to Western thought. Our conception of formal logic initiates with him. And here's a good resource from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy about him. So, that's a lot of, I have a lot on this slide. So the reading for today comes from the Nicomachean Ethics. Nicomachus is Aristotle's son, so it's kind of like ethics from a boy. It's Aristotle's major work on ethics. In your reading, he argues that happiness is the purpose of all human action. Let's think about what that means. Why do you want anything at all? Why do you do anything at all? Why are you in this class? When you eat something delicious, how do you feel? Why do you like your favorite hobby? If you're in a sport, why bother at all? Isn't it difficult? Raising children is really, really hard. Why do it? There are so many different kinds of answers to these questions, but ultimately, for Aristotle, it boils down to the simple fact that we do things, even unpleasant things, because they will help us be happy. That's what we want. We want happiness. On a personal note, why do I scoop my cat's litter box? Because it's my duty, or because if the cats are unhappy, then I'll be unhappy. If I want my cats happy, why don't I let Loki eat exclusively kitten food? Because the vet told me I would kill him if I continued to let him eat kitten food. Apparently, it's bad for adult cats. For Aristotle, happiness is not the same thing as joy. Here's the definition Aristotle gives for what happiness is. It's an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, and if there is more than one form of virtue, in accordance with the best and most complete. Happiness is not when you're overwhelmed with emotion. It's quite the opposite, in fact. Happiness for Aristotle, you might say, is more akin to contentedness, to balance. Again, Aristotle's arguing that happiness is the purpose or end of all human action, and yet it's somehow related to virtue. It's an activity of your soul in accordance with virtue, and the best kind of virtue. So happiness is the most important thing. How do we get happiness? Through acting ethically. Okay, let's talk about virtue ethics. This is neither a consequentialist or non-consequentialist ethical theory. Rather, it emphasizes a person's individual virtues or moral character, as well as the idea that happiness is the goal of life and virtue is the way of attaining that happiness. Let that sink in. Happiness is your goal. Virtue is the only real way to attain it. And also, virtue is individual to you. We're going to get to unpack what that means soon. Here's a link to that video I want you to watch. It's going to be really helpful for you in understanding the text. It's one of the things you'll have to do in order to complete this week's assignments. So here's a quote from the introduction of our text. Virtue ethics is a school of thought that takes moral excellence or virtue to be the proper focus of reflection on ethics. For adherents of this position, rules for actions are derivative of the virtues. The goal of life is to be happy. Happiness is not a wild emotion, it is a stable one. How do we get happy? Through virtue. Virtue is what is going to help us be happy. Every action we do should be virtuous. That's going to have to come down to what do we mean when we say virtuous, but let's slow down. The next 3 slides, which we're not going to go over in depth, give a rundown of each of the chapters of the Nicomachean Ethics you read. So basically, it's like book 1 and book 2 is what you read selections from, but something like paragraphs or certain amounts of paragraphs are called chapters and they're numbered, right? So I provided an outline that I found on the internet, and you could too. But this is basically just like a quick outline that says what each chapter is going on, or what's going on in each chapter. And you can get to where we get to the understanding of the goal of human life is happiness, and what does that mean, and how do we get it. So we're not going to go too far into any of these until we get to chapter 13, right? Since happiness is an activity of soul in accordance with perfect virtue, we must consider the nature of virtue, for perhaps we shall thus see better the nature of happiness. So this is how Aristotle gets us from this idea that we all want to be happy ultimately to the only way to get that is through virtue. Right? So we know it has something to do with virtue. How do we get there? He's going to go into that in the next book. And he does distinguish between moral virtue and intellectual virtue. Moral virtue is better in a lot of ways. Intellectual virtue you can just learn. Moral virtue, he says, you can only gain through habit. So I just said that. So as he goes into book 2, this is a very important slide, and we're going to go over each of the chapters really quickly. So in book 2, chapter 1, he says that intellectual virtue comes from learning and moral virtue comes from habit. In the second chapter, he says moral virtues are destroyed both by deficiency and by excess. Deficiency and by excess. Okay, so intellectual virtue is being able to write good, talking real nice, being able to study, being a smart person. That's something that's intellectual, and it's something you can learn. You can go to class and become a better rhetorician, and all of you have to take COM 108, which is going to help you become a better speaker, right? But moral virtue is something that's very different. It's doing the right thing. But what does that even mean? Okay, so it's something that you learn to do by habit. And so one of the examples that I really like to give in the full version of the class, which is harder to, I guess, follow. Let's see if you can follow it here. I was at Walmart out here and I'd gotten a bunch of stuff. This was a couple years ago, and I was tired because I had been painting my house, and I thought I would get myself a bath bomb, right? You know, those like circular things you put in the bath and they get all fizzy and it's nice. And it was all glittery and stuff. And so I put it in the cart, and it was silver colored. And as you may know, the cart was also silver. And so when I went to do the self checkout, because of course I didn't want to speak to a human being because I'm a weirdo, I didn't see the bath bomb, and I didn't listen to the lady when it says, please check your basket. I did not check my basket. So I leave Walmart and I look down, I'm in the parking lot, and I see the stupid bath bomb is still there. And then I have to make a decision. Now, what is the right thing to do here? Is it to continue on and just say something like, well, I guess it's fine. I'll just keep this, and no one needs to know, right? That would probably be a deficiency in moral virtue, right? Just to like steal it. Another extreme, and that would be an extreme, right? Another extreme would be to go into the store, find the manager, and give them my hand and say, I'm ready to be handcuffed. I stole this from the store. Please arrest me. That would just be kind of wacky. Like, that would not be a good idea to do, right? For a lot of reasons, but it would not, it's too much, right? That is too much. It's a little extra, right? So instead, what the right thing to do was, and this happens to be the right thing that I did, was I went into the store and I put it back. It took an extra couple minutes. It wasn't that big of a deal. I did not talk to anybody because, again, that's the whole point of the self-checkout, so I don't have to talk to anybody. But still, I put it back, and hopefully, and this was before coronavirus, so it wasn't as bad. But anyway, so I guess you can think about, for you, what would have been the best thing to do. If you have really bad social anxiety, maybe the best thing to do would be to go in and put it like on a shelf really close to the door and run away, right? Because if it would hurt you extremely to go and put it back, like emotionally, then maybe it wouldn't be the best idea. Okay, so again, moral virtues are destroyed by deficiency and by excess. Another example I like to give, and this usually works as if I have a football player in the room, right? Maybe we have one here, but say I'm at the big game, Finlandia Lions versus, I don't know, the Buffalo Cockatrices. And we're up, and we have only a couple minutes left on the game, but our star linebacker has gotten injured, right? And I happen to be at the game with I'm not a student, I'm a professor. I happen to be at a game with a student who is a football player for the team that just hadn't dressed up yet for the team, right? So the team coach comes looking for someone, right? If my student sitting next to me, the football player, comes up and says, I'll come in, coach, that is what he should be doing, right? It is actually, the right kind of courage for him to do that, to come in and say, I'm going to go in, coach. If I went in and said, I'll do it, coach, as your philosophy professor that's never played football, and also him like a million times weaker and not big enough to be a linebacker, if I went in and said, I'll come in, coach, put me in, that would be ridiculous, right? That's not a good plan. And then I would literally get destroyed by the other team, right? So that's not courage. That's too much courage. It's foolishness, right? And if our football player friend that had the courage to do it, right, and was doing a moral thing by joining, if that football player said, I don't want to because I don't feel like it, that person would be a coward, right? Because they'd had too little courage. So there's such a thing as too much courage and too little courage, and that's what he's getting at, right? So on chapter 3, he says that virtue and pleasure, he says moral excellence is concerned with pleasures and pain, right? What's going to cause you pleasure? What's going to cause you pain? Chapter 4, virtuous acts require knowing what you're doing, willing actions for its own sake, and proceeding from a fixed and settled disposition. So to do something that's virtuous or to actually be virtuous, you actually have to know that you're doing that thing. I mean, there's plenty of times when I've accidentally helped someone and didn't realize it, right? You know, you ever accidentally like step on someone's shoe and they had to bend down, but then the bus that would have hit them goes by on the street, right? You know, it's like there's plenty of things that you do that you don't know that you're doing something that's going to help someone. So I don't get brownie points for that, right? You have to want the action. So you have to know what you're doing. You have to want to do that thing for the outcome that you're desiring. And you have to be coming from a fixed and settled disposition. So what does that mean? A fixed and settled disposition. So chapter 7 gets us into the meat and bones of Nicomachean ethics and what we're talking about with virtue. And we get this chart of the virtues, right? And to see virtue for Aristotle has to do with feelings, right? External goods and social life. The corresponding virtues to these kinds of, this particular summary has just like an account with words of what is virtuous, right? Bravery, temperance, blah, blah, blah. But it's hard to visualize it. So here's a chart. There's literally a million of these charts online. You can see them, right? So for Aristotle, for something to be virtuous, it has to be in the mean between excess and deficiency, and the mean is relative to you, right? If I had horrible social anxiety, right, it would probably be courage for me to go to a friend's party, right? To like, if I had bad social anxiety, it would be courageous of me to go to a friend's party. It would be rash to agree to put on a party in my house if I had bad social anxiety, right? That's too much. I mean, there's such a thing as too much courage, right? Because what would happen if I had a party at my house and I was super socially anxious and then I felt terrible and it could really hurt me? And on the other hand, if I'm socially anxious and I refuse to ever go outside, well, that's cowardice. That's not enough courage, right? And where you stand on that is going to be different for different people, right? Some people are really extroverted. Having the party at their house is just normal and courageous, right? They have normal courage. If a socially extroverted person refused to go to the party, it might be a little bit deficient. They might be a little bit deficient in courage. The means between two extremes is what we want, where we want to be, right? So another example is this. Honor and dishonor, right, is a sphere of action or feeling, and here's the mean is magnanimity. Okay, and you got pusillanimity and vanity. Okay, so when you're thinking about this, it has to do, like if we think in terms of the way people act, right? If someone has a really good paying job, right, they might, when they go out with their friends, pay for dinner. Or pay for drinks or something like that, right? That's the nice thing to do, right? If they're kind of jerks about it and say, you're too poor to pay for this thing, that's being a bit extra. And if they go out to dinner and they never, ever pay for drinks or offer to ride or pay for the Uber or whatever, that's deficient, right? And as we go on here, like when we think of the sphere of action or feeling of conversation, there's a difference between being a witty person and funny, right? And being an a-hole or being super boring, right? You know the kind of people that say that they tell it like it is or that they're just being honest? Often they're not acting virtuously because they're not acting in the mean between two extremes, right? Because they're just being mean. Rude, rather. Social conducts, we've got friendliness as the mean. Cantankerousness, which is a great word, but kind of rudeness and grumpiness, and obsequiousness is over the top nicest, right? Again, like what friendliness to you is will depend on you. There are some people, you ever meet those people that are like the nicest people in the world? That's just who they are. And so it's reasonable for them to be super duper friendly, right? But if you're on this end and you're not that nice, and then suddenly you're acting like over the top nice, that's extra. Don't be that way, right? The idea here with this mean between two extremes for Aristotle is that by acting this way, you will be happy because you're not going to be acting in a way that harms yourself, right? If the football player lets his philosophy professor go into the field to do something that he should be doing, then he's going to have to live with his cowardice, right? You don't want to have to live with cowardice or live with your own vulgarity. Sometimes it depends, right? But anyway, okay, let's move on. So, by the way, it's the means between the extremes of excess and deficiency. That's where virtue lives. So, for your discussion board post, and by the way, again, it's ethics because by acting, but like according to the mean between two extremes, you will be acting ethically in a way that encourages your own happiness, right? Basically being a good person helps you to be happy in a lot of ways. So for this discussion board post this week, let's look at it over here for the Monday, Tuesday, when we still have like a whole second half of the thing to do. So your discussion board post is here. That is the week 3 discussion board post. So this is the one we're on. Yeah. Okay. So here's the assignment. You can read it, but the original post is due at 11:59 p.m. and the response posts are due by Friday at 11:59. Some of you lost points because you didn't do response posts. I just want you to respond to their posts, your colleagues' posts. They put work into it, and so do you. Okay, so I'm gonna pause speaking for about 3 seconds. If you want to pause it, because this is just the Monday, Tuesday lecture. Maybe I won't pause speaking. I'll do the Mississippis, and then we'll go on. Okay. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. Okay. So, week 3 assignments, Thursday, Friday. You're going to be reading John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism. You're going to be watching Utilitarianism Crash Course Philosophy number 36. The link is on Canvas. You're going to complete the discussion board post, and you're going to take reading quiz 2. It's due by 11:59 p.m. on Friday. John Stuart Mill, who lived between 1806 to 1873, was a very influential British political philosopher of the 19th century. If you take my modern philosophy course, you'll be able to learn more about him. In this course, we're thinking about his ethical thought. You may have run into this quote pictured here as you were doing the reading for Mill, and I'd like you to keep this quotation in mind as we move to his ethical theory. So, John Stuart Mill writes, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." More specifically, John Stuart Mill is referring to the fact that higher order reason allows people to have higher order pleasures. Sure, we can see the imperfections of the world, but with them we can also truly experience the goodness of the world. What do I mean by this? Being a human is better than being just an animal, right? And being a human that is intellectually powered, like you are, is better than being a human that doesn't, or more pleasurable than being a human that does not care about these things. There are wasps that are just like making nests in my windows. And I made the mistake of looking outside. Whoops. Anyway, so let's go on. I just want you to think about this. So we're about to talk about pleasure and happiness again. We're going to have to pause and think about what that happiness means. Like Aristotle, Mill's ethical theory, utilitarianism, has human happiness as its major focus and goal. However, utilitarianism is very distinct from Aristotle's virtue ethics in several ways. For starters, it is not as concerned with individual happiness, but with happiness in general. Moreover, it is a consequentialist ethical theory, which means that which means that it matters what the outcome of someone's action is when we think of its ethical weight. Another way to think about this is an action is morally right when the outcome of that action produces happiness. Here's the actual quote of the definition of the theory, what he calls the greatest happiness principle. The creed, which accepts as the foundations of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain, by unhappiness pain, and the privation of pleasure. Ooh. So this slide gives a short outline of what's going on in the chapters you read, right? In the chapter 2, he defines utilitarianism, goes over criticisms of utilitarianism in chapter 4. He gives the different kinds of proofs for the principle of utility or the greatest happiness principle. This is a much shorter lecture part because I don't know how complicated. There's a lot to talk about here, and if we were like together in a physical classroom, this conversation that I'm having with you now would be longer. But that's why we have discussion board activities. So I don't want you to feel like I keep referencing my in-person class as something that's not necessarily better. It's just that this is a different way of doing things because I can only talk for so long and your ears can only listen for so long. But really what's the important thing here is this is an ethical theory that is telling you how you ought to live, right? But this is not looking into character like Aristotle, my personal character. It's looking at like the grander scheme of things, right? An action is morally right when it generally promotes happiness, right, to the most amount of people and the absence of pain, right? So even if it would please me greatly to kick my brother in the shins, right? Even if that would please me, actually, just because I'd be happy doing it, it would actually cause more pain, right? Because my brother would be upset, my mom would be angry at me, and my brother would probably kick me back, and they're stronger than me. All right, I have 4 brothers, so who knows who I'd be kicking in this instance. Don't tell them I'm saying these things. I'm putting this on the internet. Oh, no. Anyway, kicking brothers aside, when you do an action, right, it affects other people. And so this moral principle is saying, like, look, you have to think about how your actions are going to affect other people. And that's what makes it right or wrong, right? So for your discussion board, this week is a little different from the previous ones. For this one, I want you to write a 2-page essay that includes a 1-page summary of utilitarianism, as this is double space, by the way, as well as a 1-page example of an ethical situation that you can solve through the utilitarian calculus, which is how many people are happy after this thing and how many people are not happy or in pain, right? You must demonstrate your knowledge of the materials, and please don't plagiarize. And then respond to each of your classmates' examples with a discussion of how their example can be made to better fit Mill's theory. If you do decide to use like references to other texts like Wikipedia, or I prefer you use the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy or the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy online, I want you to include hyperlinks to those materials, okay? This is not going to be graded as an academic essay, but I do want you to think about it in terms, make sure there's paragraphs, and you'll be posting those to the discussion boards by 11:59 p.m. on Thursday, and then respond to your classmates by 11:59 p.m. on Friday. And for this one, you only need to respond to 1 or 2 of their answers. In speaking of papers, before we move on, I want to give you a heads up about paper 1, which is due at the end of week 4. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more next week, but you can also should be able to see the prompts. But here's the prompt here. Paper 1 is worth 20% of your final grade. It's due electronically on Canvas through Turnitin by 11:59 p.m. on Friday, June 12th. You must include a paper 1 evaluation checklist with your paper. Actually, what I've done to make that easier for you, the prompt is here. If you go to the paper 1 evaluation checklist button right here, there's a link. And this link you'll have, so I'm already logged in, you can tell because of my face, to finlandia.edu. So you have to be logged into your Finlandia Gmail when you do this, but you can actually go through and then choose. So this is the self-evaluation checklist that's on the paper prompt, and you can just choose which do you agree, somewhat agree, strongly agree, etc. For the checklist, right? The categories are mechanics, introduction, conclusion, argument, ethical issue, assignment. And this is, I want to see what your how you think you did. I'm not going to be grading based upon what you said. It's possible that you give you're very reflective, and I just happen to agree with everything you say, but I won't say like, oh, I was going to give them an A, but they want a B, so I'm going to give them a B. I'm not going to do that. This is just, I want you to reflect, look at each of the categories and reflect upon how you think you did on the paper, right? The paper prompt is here. In this paper, you are to compare and contrast 2 positions from the history of Western ethical thought with regard to an ethical issue from one of the films we've watched so far in class. So we watched Ex Machina in week 1, in week 1, or week 2. I think it was week 2. Or Avengers Infinity Wars, and that's going to be in week 4, right? This ethical issue may be of your own choosing, but can include the moral status of androids, whether Thanos did anything wrong, is it okay to trade lives, etc. Your paper will be evaluated as academic writing, all ideas, sentences, etc. to be your own. Please view the paper 1 evaluation checklist before beginning your work on this paper. It's supposed to be 3 to 4 pages, double spaced, 12 times New Roman, with 1-inch margins. Don't get cute and mess with the margins. Another thing, do I have it up? Yeah. Here's the prompt is going to be online. I'm going to send it to you too. You are using text, so you're comparing and contrasting 2 positions from the history of Western ethical thought. You have to use Plato, Aristotle, Mill, or Kant in this paper, and you're comparing and contrasting their ethical modes of how to choose right and wrong with a particular ethical issue or question that comes from one of the movies that you watched. Okay, does that make sense? We'll talk about it more next week, and I'll send you emails about it, etc., etc. If you have any questions, as always, let me know. Don't forget to take the reading quiz this week. Don't forget. That's it for now. Tune in next week where we'll be discussing deontology. Dun, dun, dun. It means duty ethics. It's the Kant reading we're doing next week. Okay, bye, everybody. Oh, wait. I was supposed to turn it off when I said that. Did I say